This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is After Accountability, a critical genealogy of a concept by the Pinko Collective. Through a compelling combination of oral history and reflective essays, After Accountability offers a remarkably subtle and compassionate inquiry into the circulation of the complex abolitionist concept accountability, which has been taken up as a core principle within leftist organizing and activity over the past quarter century. As Sophie Lewis puts it, grasping a nettle that seems to have stung almost all of us, one way or another, on the anti-capitalist left, the Pinko Collective has accomplished something extraordinary with After Accountability, illuminating a way to move forward together in integrity, trust, and militant carefulness. Find After Accountability at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Trump has stocked his administration with reactionaries dead set on making the nativist bluster of his first term into a Fortress America reality. They promise mass deportations and are developing a new and possibly more extensive Muslim and travel ban that could include targeting people on ideological grounds. Trump has already signed an executive order to deport legal non-citizens who participated in pro-Palestine anti-genocide protests. He's declared the end of birthright citizenship, suspended refugee admissions, canceled legal status for hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans, leveraged tariff threats against Mexico, Canada, and Colombia to support his anti-migrant agenda, moved to open a migrant camp at Guantanamo, explored outsourcing immigration detention to Bukele's El Salvador, and, unfortunately, so much more. Right before I sat down to record this, I saw that he sued the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago for failing to cooperate with ICE. Meanwhile, after Biden and Harris ran and predictably lost a tough-on-the-border presidential campaign, many Democrats are now simply rolling over, supporting aspects of Trump's agenda and calling for a return to the days of bipartisan moderate immigration policy, a policy known as Comprehensive Immigration Reform, or CIR. CIR was the dominant immigration policy for the first decade and a half of this century, supported by both George W. Bush and Barack Obama. It combined a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants with an intensification of immigration and border enforcement, and, for big business, an expansion of guest worker programs. Something, supposedly, for everybody. But CIR failed to pass Congress due to opposition from an increasingly nativist right that opposed any form of legalization, period. In response, Bush and Obama doubled down on enforcement, hoping to placate the nativist right, and in doing so, sell them on a grand bargain. Bush, with strong Democratic support, signed the 2006 Secure Fence Act, which led to the construction of hundreds of miles of border fencing and wall. He also conducted massive workplace raids. Obama rolled out a program called Secure Communities, which alerted ICE to arrests made by police departments all across the country. Deportations skyrocketed, but the radicalization of the nativist right only intensified. Democrats giving the nativist right a lot of what they wanted only led them to demand all of what they wanted more vociferously. And then Trump, descending that golden elevator of his eponymous tower, called them criminals, drug dealers, and rapists, and sometimes, he supposed, good people. And he called for the wall. And so CIR never became law, but it did lay the groundwork for Trump's first election, first by ratifying the right-wing premise that so-called illegal immigration is a major threat to the nation, and second, by conflating immigration and criminality in the popular imagination. In other words, Democrats really do think that if you say, hey, Republicans are right, the border is out of control, but we have a tough and repressive, but also less draconian solution, they think that voters will then reward Democrats. This my friends, is reheated Bill Clintonism. And while it may have served Bill Clinton all right, it ultimately led to the collapse of working class support for the Democratic Party and to the rise of the far right. And a key part of this is because from the 90s on, all of this bipartisan demonization of immigrants, of mobile labor, it was all about redirecting anger away from mobile capital, from neoliberal globalization. In a November 1996 memo to Bill Clinton, sent just a week after he won re-election, advisor Rahm Emanuel pointed to the 1994 crime bill and said, quote, "Illegal immigration legislation provides that same opportunity." Emanuel wrote that it was important that Clinton could, quote, "claim and achieve record deportations of criminal aliens." Emanuel wrote that, as with welfare and crime, immigration provided an opportunity for vintage Clinton triangulation. Quote, "By incorporating the opposition's rhetoric, you remove their policy claims." What happened, of course, is not what Emanuel said would happen. What happened is that Democratic triangulation on immigration ultimately just elevated and legitimated right-wing nativist rhetoric and advanced right-wing nativist policy aims. Today, the amnesiac Democrats want to do it all over again. That brief Democratic negative polarization against Trump during his first term in defense of immigrants, that was an aberration spurred by popular indignation. My interview today is with Chris Newman, the legal director of the National Day Laborers Organizing Network, or NDLON. NDLON supports day laborer organizing centers around the country, which helps immigrant workers, often undocumented, stand up for their rights on the job. Chris and I have been talking about immigration politics for a decade and a half, and the analysis we developed through those conversations led me to write my book, All-American Nativism: How the Bipartisan War on Immigrants Explains Politics as We Know It. Colombian President Gustavo Petro said in December 2023, quote, "What we are seeing in Gaza is the rehearsal of the future. Why have large carbon-consuming countries allowed the systematic murder of thousands of children in Gaza? Because Hitler has already entered their homes, and they are getting ready to defend their high levels of carbon consumption and reject the exodus it causes." I think that Petro is absolutely right. That's where mainstream politics across the global north have taken us for decades. And right now, it's what the ascendant far right wants to speed up with terrifying intensity. Our job on the left is to develop an alternative vision for humanity and to build the power we need to win it. We've got a lot of work to do, and we're way behind. Before we get started, this is, as you likely know, a listener-supported podcast, and the place where you, our listeners, can support us is patreon.com/thedig. We put out every episode for free, no paywalls, because this podcast for us is fundamentally a political education project that aims to arm you with the analysis you need to do the work we all need to change everything. That only works, this model we have, because listeners like you donate. Plus, if you live in the U.S., we have books, coffee mugs, tote bags to send you, depending on how much you donate. And all contributors of any amount anywhere get our occasional newsletter delivered by email, which is really, really good. Please donate now. That's patreon.com/thedig. Click the link in the show notes, make a contribution. It keeps the dig up and running strong. Lastly, in the show notes, I'll put a link to my book page at Verso for All-American Nativism, a link to a recent N+1 essay that I wrote in the show notes, and a link to a ProPublica story that lays out Trump's Day 1 immigration executive orders in great detail. Okay, here's Chris Newman, legal director at the National Day Laborer Organizing Network and faculty in the UCLA Labor Studies Department. Chris Newman, welcome back to The Dig.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Let's start where you are right now in Los Angeles at a mutual aid hub that Endelon runs in Pasadena, just outside of what had been the evacuation zone for the Eden fire. Immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, do a ton of work during normal times to keep LA running, including Stephen Miller's hometown of Santa Monica. Could the reconstruction of burned down neighborhoods, some of them very wealthy neighborhoods, is that even imaginable happening without immigrant labor?
No, certainly not in California and not around the country. And I'm glad that we're starting there because I've worked at Endelon for 20 years and I've never been more proud of the work that we're doing at the Pasadena Job Center, which, as you pointed out, was right next to the fire zone in Altadena. So by way of background, there are over 70 day labor worker centers in the United States that are sort of hybrid institutions that are akin to unions where people can have minimum wage and access rights and services in their community while working. And they're also sort of like settlement houses. People have written how they're akin to what Jane Addams did in Chicago. And it just so happens, as a blessing or a curse, the only center that our national network actually administers was in Pasadena. So immediately when the fires began, we used it as a place for people to seek refuge and help. And it so happens that we had not stopped our food bank work that we had been doing since COVID. And we had been providing food and essential resources to those people that were forced to work often to their death during COVID. And so our center was sort of known as a place where immigrants could come and get help. And what has emerged from that effort has been extraordinary. We've had days where we've had over 1,000 volunteers working shoulder to shoulder, day laborers doing cleanup and helping people get access to their houses where they were evacuated but not yet touched by the fires. And we know from similar experiences around the country that after natural disasters, day laborers become what are referred to as second responders, who come in after the disaster occurs and clear away the debris, the rubble, do the cleanup, and the most difficult and dangerous and low-paying jobs that are an integral part of the rebuilding process. And certainly that will be the case in Los Angeles. And thankfully we have...
look at New Orleans after Katrina.
Well, I was on one of the first flights into New Orleans after Katrina. And at the time, New Orleans had one of the smallest immigrant populations of any major city in the country. Mostly the Latino immigrants that were there were of Honduran descent. But afterward, day laborers came from throughout the entire region and were 100% integral in rebuilding that city. And I can say that actually there was a day labor corner that deeply ironically was at General Lee Circle in New Orleans. It was the biggest day labor corner that I've seen in 20 years working with day laborers. There was over 500 people jumping in and out of trucks doing the work. And, after that, you saw Hurricane Sandy, similar effort up in the Northeast. And so our member organizations have known for years that day laborers are an integral part of reconstruction. I will point out that among the immediate terrible impacts of Trump's litany of executive orders and his sort of initial policy maneuvers has been to basically separate organizations like ours from institutions like OSHA. And so Endelon, I think, has one of the largest Spanish language OSHA 10 certification programs in the country. And that's the good news. The bad news is, obviously, we're no longer working with the administration because of the criminal penalties that they're imposing on nonprofits and unions and others.
I want to spend a lot of time on Democratic and liberal complicity and just outright political stupidity. And sometimes it's hard to tease out which is which, of course. But first, let's cover in some detail what's taking shape right now in the Trump administration, starting with the long-promised campaign of mass deportation. What do the administration's plans look like to the extent that we can fully know at the moment? What have we seen in terms of what the architecture of mass deportations might look like, and whether they're going to be able to build a deportation architecture that fulfills those plans? Does what we saw last week in Chicago offer any hints?
I mean, I think it does. And there's so much to say about this, and maybe we can kind of unpack it slowly. But clearly, part of the initial project of the Trump administration to consolidate power is to propagate fear. Having succeeded in creating among the MAGA base a fear of immigrants, a fear of refugees, and the like, the plan, I think, very much is to instill fear among immigrants and their supporters at the initial stages. I mean, it really is important to note that, at least at its inception, the Trump administration, still only has X number of ICE agents that can do X number of things in a given day. And we'll talk about how they plan to kind of enlist force multipliers, I assume, when we talk about sanctuary cities and the like. But to begin with, they only have so much sort of in the way of human resources. And what they are trying to do is terrify immigrants into leaving. And I think this is a really important place, I think, in some ways, to start this conversation, because a common misconception, I think, that has existed for over 20 years in debates about immigration reform is that the goal of these eugenicist, nativist organizations that now occupy places in the White House, that their goal is, in fact, to physically arrest and deport 11 million people. But in fact, that has never been their goal, nor has it been part of the strategic plan of DHS. What has been part of the goal is to engage in a war of attrition against immigrant families, using the spectacle of, or the moral panic about, undocumented status as a means to kind of try to sever people's ability to live decent lives in this country. So no access to jobs, no access to education, no access to rights if one is injured. And so I think the initial moves of the Trump administration must be understood within the context of this broader war of attrition. And by the way, I'll point out that this is not just some type of, speculating about motives. As you know, Daniel, I was counsel in one of the civil rights challenges against Arizona's SB 1070, which in some ways was a sort of blueprint for what was to follow. And written right into that law in the second sentence was the goal to engage in this war of attrition.
This is their terminology: attrition through enforcement.
Attrition through enforcement, and unfortunately, for years, this notion of self-deportation became a laugh line because of the way Mitt Romney kind of bungled his explanation of this project, and people kind of laughed and shrugged. But it's actually something far more sinister. And again, super duper important is for people to understand that the architects of this war of attrition and its political project, that has ensued, they don't care particularly about immigration status, lawful or unlawful. They know, for example, that immigration status is something that is highly malleable and changes from time to time. They want less of everyone when it comes to the foreign-born, non-white population. So if they can somehow scare a mixed status family of citizens and immigrants into leaving the country, that's what they want to do. And so I think in its onset, that is the intention. Now, obviously, there are some material changes to enforcement that they are trying to undertake, and chief among them is their war on sanctuary policies. And the reason for that is quite simple. The only way that they can effectuate large numbers of what we would think of as real deportations in this mass deportation project is if they enlist and conscript more, sort of hands to work on their project. And so that involves enlisting local police, sheriffs, and the criminal justice infrastructure as a kind of pipeline for deportation. And so part and parcel to their initial effort has been both to do these terrorizing raids, but also to delegitimize the sanctuary policies.
And that infrastructure for what critical scholars call crimmigration, that preexists the rise of Trump by many, many years. We could date it back to laws passed under Bill Clinton. We could date it back to 287G law enforcement agency ICE partnerships that began to be rolled out under George W. Bush, or secure communities, which was initiated under George W. Bush, but really rolled out under Obama, which gave ICE access to every single arrest, essentially, that happens anywhere in this country. And that's the infrastructure created by Trump's quote unquote normal bipartisan predecessors that he's going to exploit for that force multiplier you're talking about. And it also created the political infrastructure for Trumpism in the sense that this conflation between criminality and immigration was established long, long, long ago by people who like to consider themselves rather different than Donald Trump.
Quite so. And this might be a good time for me to thank you for breaking with your normal practice of inviting authors of books onto this podcast, which I listen to and adore and rely upon. And it might be a good time for me to plug your book, Daniel, because I think what you just said in the preface of that question is well elaborated in your book, which I think is available online and through booksellers, All American Nativism, where you do talk about the origins of this bipartisan war on immigrants that has fomented and distorted politics for the last several decades. And you're quite right as well to lay at the feet of Barack Obama the responsibility of the nub of the sanctuary cities and state debate, which we're now going to be forced to re-engage in a different way, because it was the Obama administration through as well executive fiat that forced all states who shared any information about arrests as part of their normal practice. If you're arresting somebody to see if they're wanted, in another state for child support or, on some federal watch list, it was the Obama administration which fused the databases and made interoperable the databases between DHS and the FBI. And so what emerged in reaction to the Obama administration's own policy of mass deportation were these sub-federal policies, which are now known euphemistically as sanctuary policies, but super important, I think, for people to understand. Unfortunately, because we weren't able to stop the Obama administration from this original sin of basically forcing every single person who's fingerprinted in the country to be known to DHS, everything that happens in terms of the sanctuary debate happens kind of downstream of that arrest. It has to do with the unlawful arrest, detention, and removal of people because of interactions with the criminal justice system. That doesn't in any way actually remedy the harm that happens even upstream of that. And, so we've seen in places like Arizona and unfortunately other states where this newfound kind of policing power on the part of police and sheriffs, and particularly these radicalized, so-called constitutional policing sheriffs, where they now use this power as a pretext to over-police people in the first place. And so, of course, Joe Arpaio was an example of that. Just blatantly unconstitutional racial profiling and over-policing of immigrant communities as a pretext to get people into the criminal justice system so that they could then short-circuit the criminal justice system and remove people.
Joe Arpaio, whose rise, I just have to mention, Janet Napolitano was deeply complicit in. And we're going to do this almost every single subject we talk about, because there really is bipartisan complicity every step of the way.
And I'm sure we'll come back to Arizona at various points too, because in some ways, Arizona has been this kind of laboratory for the kind of, prototypical fascism that we're seeing develop in response to this, false specter of an immigrant invasion and the like. But yeah, we will hopefully reference your book, and hopefully your listeners will buy and read the book as well, because I do think it goes a long way to explaining the antecedents of this whole Trump situation that we're in.
It is my book in a sense, but the book is also the product of conversations that the two of us had been having for like a decade prior. So.
Well, but they started out just because we're going to need the same spirit again. There were a lot of people that were incredulous that Barack Obama, who ran on hope and progress, and all of the the tropes that he enlisted, people were incredulous that he was deporting and criminalizing 400,000 people per year. And I don't remember at the time where you were stationed.
I was at the city paper, but I wrote this for Salon.com in, I think, 2011. One of the first articles on secure communities.
Well, I mean, it was courageous activists that kind of fought back against the reality, which was, again, we were witnessing in Arizona and other places, but what became, the anti-deportation movement, which is now being, and I'm sure we'll get to that, maligned by the Democratic elites. But there were only a few reporters that I think were even comfortable reporting. People honestly couldn't fathom the fact that the first Black president of the United States was responsible through, the stroke of a pen for criminalizing so many immigrants and for really radically changing the law and politics involved in immigration enforcement. You're quite right to point out that for a long time before, now there had always been ad hoc cooperation between police and sheriffs and the INS, which preceded ICE. And ICE has always been, since its inception in 2002, a rogue federal law enforcement agency. But this really formalized the fusion of local criminal law enforcement into the federal civil immigration law enforcement. And it was really just I do think with the course of time, I think the Obama administration will unfortunately be held to account for unfortunately laying the groundwork for Trumpism, even as Trump, began his own rise by accusing President Obama of being an undocumented immigrant.
Right. And this is so key because it's Obama's critical role in laying the groundwork for Trump, both in terms of politically laying the groundwork and in terms of building the actual enforcement architecture.
Quite right.
To circle back to Trump part one, his first campaign in 2016, he ran for office and took power initially pledging to build the wall. The wall, of course, was already very much under construction. It had mostly been constructed, which most people didn't know at the time. But thanks to the Bipartisan Secure Fence Act of 2006, that built led to hundreds and hundreds of miles of border fence, which in many places looks like what one would call a wall. That's from 2006. That's a bill that Obama and Clinton and Biden all voted for in the Senate. But Trump nonetheless runs on building the wall as though there isn't already a wall. But then this last campaign in 2024, it was all about mass deportation. What should we make of this change, this decade-long trajectory between Trump's first campaign to him running last year and taking office now? There is one thing that I think we'll circle back to throughout this interview is that there is a commonality where immigrant criminality is key in both cases. This time, Laken Riley, the time before Kate Steinle, the so-called angel moms of people, the mothers of people killed by undocumented immigrants. Why, though, the wall then and mass deportations now?
I think to me, it's clear that Trump kind of seduced himself into this whole build the wall call and response that he had with his crowds after he famously, came down the escalator accusing, Mexican immigrants of being criminals. And there's no question that there was a sort of politics of, or a political theater involved, where the wall itself was a metaphor for something much bigger, something much more insidious. And I know that you have had the great Wendy Brown on this podcast multiple times, and I promise I won't, or maybe I will, keep recommending books throughout the interview. But Wendy Brown wrote this amazing book called
Walled States, Waning Sovereignty.
Right, Walled States and Waning Sovereignty, where it wasn't just in the United States. Professor Brown was looking around the world and asking the question why walls were so in vogue, as there has been this kind of common crisis of modern sovereignty to respond to global challenges, and why it is that medieval solutions were being sort of so popular in being proposed for modern problems. And so clearly there was this kind of empty vessel of political theater that was being served. And I think now, 8 years later, they have far more sophistication to a project that is being advanced by people around Trump, because it's relatively clear to me, and I won't get into the business of, pop psychology or trying to examine what, Trump intends to do or what he thinks in any given moment. It's relatively clear to me that he doesn't give a shit one way or another about immigration, but sees this as a sort of means to attaining power and legitimacy and the like. And I think, now mass deportation.
And I should add, he's not wrong about that at all. This is Trump's political genius, is his ability to sense in a very guttural way what will most spectacularly, energetically activate the right-wing base. And if we go back from the 1990s through today, very much including the mid-1990s, very much including the Tea Party revolution of 2010, all of these moments, whether centrists and liberals are caring about immigration or not, it is the animating, red-hot, fiery core of right-wing politics in this country.
Sure. You can go further back and talk about, the Minuteman Project and Chris Simcox and I forget the other guy's name, where they had more press than vigilantes when they first started their so-called patrol of the border, which, by the way, again, not to sound hysterical, but literally was the idea of David Duke from the Ku Klux Klan.
From 1979.
From 1979, where he quite specifically said that we can kind of, reemerge in prominence and normalize ourselves by, engaging in these kinds of vigilante patrols of the border. And that predates even the Tea Party. 1977. Okay, so you've got good producers, hot on the draw. The interesting thing, as you say that, Daniel, is on this, in some ways, it's like Trump holds this also in common with the Democratic political class, who for, I think, far, too long have been kind of more interested in what they thought were the politics of immigration than the actual policy itself. You know what I mean? And in some ways, it's like Trump is just doing better than the Democrats at utilizing immigration as a kind of amorphous, dehumanized issue, although it has real consequences for real people, toward his political advantage. But again, and who knows? Maybe he does have some deep-seated, psychological fear or trauma related to immigration. I don't think so. But I do think that there are people now around him in his orbit that have a very sophisticated idea of what they are doing. And again, I just can't, emphasize this enough.
And we're talking about the likes of Stephen Miller.
The Bannon people. All of the there's this network of nonprofit institutions that were formed and funded by a eugenicist from Michigan, the so-called Tanton Network. That these people all, occupy positions in the Trump administration.
FAIR, CIS.
Numbers USA. And their project truly is to stop the arrival of non-white immigrants to the United States. And in addition to just sort of being overt racists and eugenicists, they are quite sophisticated in the types of policy levers that they are pulling to achieve their goal.
Speaking of political theater, accompanying ICE agents on these recent raids across Chicago was absurdly, stupidly, and evilly none other than daytime television star Dr. Phil. In New York, it was DHS Secretary Chris Newman performing for the cameras, all made up with her hair blown out like a Fox News host about to attend a gala at Mar-a-Lago. With Trump, and we've been touching on this, how do you think about the theater of enforcement relating to the actual enforcement? We've been talking about fear as a sort of force multiplier that will, in Mitt Romney's words, cause immigrants to self-deport. But is the audience for some of this, Dr. Phil and Kristi Noem stuff, is it really more the MAGA base or potential MAGA base?
I think it's hard to say. I think that they're Honestly, they're targeting multiple audiences all at the same time. I mean, we at Endlon kind of predicted that they would first start their spectacle of raids and deportations in a sanctuary location. So I don't think it's an accident that they chose Chicago, which I think has certainly one of the most organized communities in fighting. You know, a lot of the original resistance to Obama deportations occurred in Chicago. Some of the first places, Elvira Arellano took sanctuary in Chicago. And now there are policies, both in Chicago and the state, that were a reaction to Obama, but shielded people from Trump, that they are trying to kind of delegitimize, and penetrate. And yeah, I don't think we had on our bingo card that they would have Dr. Phil as their mouthpiece, but in some ways it's no surprise. And of course they get, incredible amplification from the echo chamber on Fox News. And I think a lot of this, as you call, performative theater of, security, it is, there's a fusion between what they're doing from government and media channels. And for a long time, and you and I have discussed this, there is this asymmetry where you have an entire ecosystem of, infotainment, for entertainment news on Fox News and all of its, progeny on the one hand, where they, are selling advertising by ginning up, fear of immigrants. On the other hand, you have crickets from, MSNBC. And so on a good day, you have, fear and antipathy being, again, lathered up in all these media ecosystems. And then at best, you get pity from the MSNBC crowd if they cover immigration at all. And so, yeah, their use of the media as a kind of itself a force multiplier is part of what they have done. And again, it doesn't surprise me that they went to Chicago. Now, it creates a real dilemma, in terms of the here and now for immigrant rights organizations like mine, particularly because as it's so clear that there is this campaign to instill fear across the board of immigrants, among immigrants. Unwittingly, a lot of times organizations with the best of intentions in responding to raids or rumors of raids are actually contributing to that, fear, misinformation, albeit with, good intentions. And I think one of the challenges that we're going to have in the next 4 years is finding good ways of documenting and sharing what's happening without scaring the shit out of people. And, I think that's going to be a challenge that, I think we'll be up to it. But, for your listeners who are involved and want to get involved in, various kind of ICE Watch efforts, it's very important to kind of ground truth the rumors before sort of being part of the sort of spreading of those rumors.
Trump has promised to go after so-called sanctuary cities. And just a reminder, something we discussed that's really important and probably not known by most people is that the whole sanctuary cities thing comes about for the first time during the Obama administration because Obama is basically conscripting local law enforcement through secure communities into doing immigration enforcement. So local immigrant rights activists all over the country put pressure on localities to be like, don't cooperate with ICE. And that's where sanctuary cities come from. And then perversely, but pretty predictably, because this is just how the history of immigration politics goes, Trump then runs against the sanctuary city policies that were created as a protest measure against Obama's deportation policies. Trump runs against sanctuary cities as though they are a creation of Obama's. Anyhow, the first Trump administration, there was, resistance to Trump's deportations from local officials. This time around, Trump has promised to aggressively persecute sanctuary cities, by which he means any municipality that puts up any roadblock at all to collaborating with ICE, in part because, politically he sees this as an opportunity to beat up on Democrats and put them in a bind. And in part, as you mentioned, it's more like logistical. ICE needs local law enforcement to do deportations as a force multiplier because there just aren't anywhere close to enough federal agents to detain and deport even a fraction of the total undocumented population on their own. How is that playing out right now, and how does that compare to what we saw during Trump's first term?
Well, I'm so happy that you articulated that history, because it is quite vexing.
It's crazy making. What do you think about it?
It's crazy making, and I mean, I can, we can spend the rest of the podcast talking about this exact thing, because I've been involved in modern sanctuary policy development for quite some time, and it is true, as you point out, that President Obama deported far more people during his first term than Trump deported in his first term. And the reason for that, a fact that neither man would like to acknowledge, is that the sanctuary policies which emerged through struggle in response to the Obama administration ultimately served as a shield against the Trump administration. And even, so for example, in California, the first sanctuary policy that we proffered, the Trust Act, the original Trust Act, the first one, saw a very simple solution to the trap and the dilemmas that were being imposed on local jurisdictions by the Secure Communities program. And the proposal very simply said that any jurisdiction that wanted to basically share its information with the FBI, but not the DHS, should be allowed to do so, because therefore, at the point of booking someone, when you're arrested but not yet, in some cases, charged and certainly not convicted, you can keep separate someone's immigration status to avoid immigration from basically inserting itself and mutating the whole criminal legal system. And in reaction to that proposal, that was the reason why the Obama administration, again, unilaterally made secure communities mandatory and said, no, at this point, if you share the fingerprints with the federal government, they're now the property of the federal government. We can share them with DHS today if we want, and the IRS tomorrow if we want. And so the sanctuary cities, which, and then sanctuary state policies, which emerge, happen after that. But as you point out, over the vociferous objection and lobbying against them by the Obama administration, it wasn't just that they were neutral or not involved. They were affirmatively very, very opposed, not only to the policies, but to the organizations that were pushing them. And we were really maligned by the Obama administration. And again, I hope we'll eventually get to it.
And the duplicitousness. Reporting on that was crazy making, because they were constantly telling me one thing about it and then another. They were lying all the time.
Well, it's crazy. I mean, 100%. And again, I can share, details from my own experience. John Sandwig, who was a senior ICE official who has kind of rebranded himself as a source for the New York Times and Washington Post as a sort of enlightened former ICE agent. I remember being at a meeting with him adjacent to the White House, begging him to put out a communication saying that the ICE detainers that come after, there was a hit from a secure communities, they would send these ICE hold forms. But there was incredible confusion out there because they were being represented as if they were arrest warrants, like federal arrest warrants. And in fact,
there's simply a request to hold someone on federal behalf. The federal government, in fact, without a warrant, cannot make anyone hold anyone for them.
100%. And so first there was a challenge in getting, and organizations like the ACLU and others eventually came around, but initially people were totally incredulous about the fact that the Obama administration was engaging in this mass program of warrantless arrests. And eventually, again, there was litigation and litigation that I've been a part of and others. And I think every court that has examined the use of these detainers has viewed them exactly as you described, as sort of totally violative of the Fourth Amendment. But I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking, to your point about the lies. They were so invested in this project. They refused to clarify even the most, obvious facts early on. And in some ways that, I guess there was some utility in that, because that, I think their duplicity and kind of, the lying, the outright lying that they did, in some ways scandalized what they called secure communities, but what, was eventually known as ESCOM. Because, you can't be against secure communities. That's like being against chocolate cake. But ESCOM sounded a little bit more ominous. Anyhow, you took me down memory lane, and I think you knew the risks involved in doing that, given how long we've talked about these topics. And like I said, I could go on and on with my outright anger to the Obama administration for putting us in this position. We now face a much different environment than we did in 2017. And in 2017, our phones were ringing off the hook from Democratic lawmakers, basically asking us to come back, in the case of California, come back with proposals to stop deportations that had been previously rejected as politically infeasible. And so at the time, for example, Senator Kevin De Leon, who was the pro tem in California, he introduced SB 54, took all of our ideas, put a staple in them, and introduced what was, would be the most abolitionist sanctuary policy. Of course, it got watered down to get a signature from Jerry Brown. This time around, our phones aren't ringing at all. And in fact, there is almost an eerie abandonment from some in defense of these sanctuary policies at a time when they need to be defended and expanded to the maximum degree because they were so effective in stopping deportations during Trump's first term. But that being said, the Trump administration is going to continue to use a line of argument that was literally used by the Obama administration against the Trust Act and other sanctuary policies, where they will somehow now blame the sanctuary policies for putting the innocent in harm's way. So the argument goes like this. They will find some person who has a mugshot that is conducive to a Fox News, evening television show segment. They will claim that that's the person that they're looking for, someone who's committed some heinous or egregious act. They will then do what they call shotgun raids in the community, where they will, arrest first and ask questions later, people who are innocent bystanders. And then they'll defend the enforcement operation as, a security operation. And then again, as a sort of cherry on the cake or whatever, their poisonous cake, they will say that it was the sanctuary policies that forced them to go and terrorize the community. And it's total like abuser, like battering behavior. But that is what they're going to do. And so they will at one and the same time contribute to the spectacle of fear by perp walking people that, seem to be bad people. They will run up their numbers of deportations, and they will delegitimize the sanctuary policies at the same time, saying, wow, if only we had just gotten them in the comfortable confines of the police station, we wouldn't have had to go out into the neighborhoods. And that is a real conundrum in terms of how we respond, particularly when there's such kind of craven, fecklessness on the part of one-time immigrant rights supporting Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, you've already heard this from the Trump administration this time around. Cooperate or we'll be out in the community and unfortunately make collateral arrests of any undocumented immigrants we run into. What sort of response are we seeing from local and state Democratic elected officials this time around? During Trump's first term, we had a liberal resistance hashtag. This time, not so much.
No, there's a real retreat going on, which again is ominous and scary. And we're not seeing, the capital R resistance of 2017, and we're not seeing a lot of elected officials rushing to defend immigrants or their communities, and it is worrisome. I think it's particularly worrisome when it comes to major city police chiefs. For a long time, they had been monolithic in their opposition to being saddled with, the dilemma and job of doing civil immigration enforcement, because they know that will, create further distance between them and the communities that they're, ostensibly protecting. Sheriffs, of course, are a different matter because, they're elected and we've seen a kind of movement of political demagoguery. And so sheriffs have always been kind of quick.
I mean, in short, sheriffs tend to be sort of yahoos.
Yahoos and they run businesses. And as someone once put it to me, they're in the business of keeping their jail beds full, and they kind of don't give a shit about, community policing. I mean, it's not like there wasn't dilemmas early on in the sanctuary campaigns either. I mean, the first bill that we ran in California was called the Trust Act, and it was, utilizing this idea of having, maintaining trust in police. And then there are those that say for, good reason you shouldn't trust the police at all. But I think, again, hopefully rational law enforcement voices will emerge in defense of sanctuary policies. Certainly politicians have been running from the defense of sanctuary cities this time around. And it's a real, I think it's going to be a real challenge for us going forward.
What's the significance of Trump having declared that unauthorized migration constitutes a, quote, invasion, especially paired with the classification of Mexican drug cartels as terrorist organizations? Just this entire, we've seen the militarization of the border for decades, but now we're seeing this sort of like seamless integration of the war on immigrants and war on drugs into kind of a MAGA militarism in a way that seems a noteworthy and disturbing intensification of these long-running trends.
No, I mean, you're quite right. And I think it's been fomenting for a while, this idea that somehow a refugee or an asylum seeker seeking to defend their own life as, an invader is kind of riddled with irony and contradiction. But again, it's this conflation of kind of the criminal threat, the economic threat, and now the national security threat posed by, peaceful immigrants. And it seems to have been a sort of radiation that's kind of made its way into the water supply of politics. And I think it is going to unfortunately require some political courage that we haven't yet seen from Democrats to step into that breach. But you're, I think, right to point out that there's something actually far more insidious at work with the declaration that there is an invasion. The reason is because, as many people have pointed out, part of what Trump is doing is right out of the gates is creating a constitutional crisis insofar as that he's, challenging the co-equal power of the three branches of the federal government. And so part of what he's doing is basically trying to usurp power from both Congress and the judiciary. And they know full well that there's a long history in this country of executive power, a reservoir of executive power in the face of an invasion. And so by declaring an invasion, by trying to make it so tautologically, they're using that as well as a legal justification for some of the patently illegal things that the executive branch is doing. And that's why, we saw some of this terminology quite literally get litigated in some of the litigation related to what Texas was doing. And if you, in some sense, buy as a legal matter that migration is an invasion, then you're more likely to kind of allow the executive branch to use a wider amount of discretionary power.
It seems like this could also implicate the Posse Comitatus Act, which is the basic law restricting U.S. military operation for domestic law enforcement.
I mean, Posse Comitatus is people are very, very worried about the use of federal military for policing inside of the borders. And I think there's a continuum on which these things are very much related. When you talk about the specter of using the National Guard or the U.S. military as enforcers of civil immigration law. And again, there's no question without, or at least trying not to sound hysterical, it does feel like we're sliding down some kind of slippery slope right here.
Another thing, speaking more in the social and political register of what this invocation of an invasion is doing, is really referencing the long-standing far-right nativist conspiracy theory of Mexicans and or Latin Americans generally undertaking some sort of reconquista of initially the American Southwest, but I think all of America, according to some far-right nuts these days, and the reconquista just being the sort of made in America version of the Great Replacement theory. You don't hear Reconquista that much anymore. I think that's more 90s, aughts vintage. I think we've our far right has really taken on the French derived Great Replacement as their go-to theory. But I think invasion really references or invokes those sorts of far right conspiracies.
Yeah, I mean, it all plays into this paranoid fantasy of white genocide, this notion that Pat Buchanan used to talk about, the Anglo-Christian, norms that are undermined by foreign non-white invaders. And unfortunately, it really has become just this kind of common part of political and legal discourse. And it is very frightening. And again, this notion of using the moral panic over undocumented immigrant status as a kind of pretext or an excuse to engage in all these, more ambitious, sinister projects, again, to try to block the arrival of non-white immigrants. That's really what's at play. And part of what I, again, and not to continue to, to be stuck in old stuff, but part of what, among the things that the Democrats have done wrong for 25 years with, this kind of yellow brick road path to citizenship idea that's been encapsulated in the comprehensive immigration reform campaign, is that it kind of has belied anyone's kind of lived experience, which is that for so many years, I mean, people who've known undocumented and worked side by side with undocumented workers, as I have my entire life, the goal has never been, for those people to find some legislative vehicle that will give them, I mean, obviously no one wants to be deprived of a path to citizenship, but the goal should have been for 25 years to continue to create cracks that allow people to find a way into status. And unfortunately, all of those cracks, have been sealed up in a kind of proverbial legal wall, preventing people who are undocumented from attaining status. Because again, people can yesterday be undocumented and tomorrow have legal status. The nativist right, they really don't give a shit about that. They are more interested in using this notion of undocumented immigrants as a class as a pretext for a far wider agenda. And again, it plays out in very material ways. We talked about and probably will keep talking about secure communities. Many people don't know that secure communities itself was a project first of the FBI and not DHS. And the goal of that project was to move from a biographical database surveillance system, your name, address, date of birth, biographical information, and move that to a biometric form of identification where your fingerprint or the human body becomes the ID. And so while we were having our debates about, sanctuary cities and secure communities, and while you were courageously, writing about them, the FBI and DHS are sitting back there very, very pleased that all of this kind of, debate about immigration was being used as cover for a far more pernicious agenda, which again is, to move to biometric surveillance. And again, it's so obvious, it shouldn't have to be pointed out, but I'll point it out anyway. If the goal in the end is to reduce the undocumented population in this country to zero, and if that's the goal of Republicans or Democrats through legalization, the only way you achieve that goal is if everyone in this country is documented at all times. It's axiomatic that the only way to decrease or end undocumented migration is for everyone to be documented. And I don't think, even the most ardent kind of zealots, who are, yelling, build the wall, have really thought through yet the kind of, insidious federal power that their chants are ultimately resulting in.
Trump's first bill signed into law was, and we touched on this earlier, it was the Laken-Riley Act, named for a young woman killed by a Venezuelan migrant in Georgia. It requires that ICE detain immigrants accused of crimes like theft because the man convicted of killing Riley had earlier been arrested for shoplifting. That's the logic. If you arrest immigrants that commit small crimes, you will stop them from later committing big crimes or something like that. What's the significance of this law, both politically and in terms of the enforcement infrastructure? Because historically, again, this is a major through line and very loud echo. Trump announced his first campaign after he came down that escalator. He announced that first campaign by calling immigrants criminals and rapists, and he finished that campaign fixated on the killing of Americans by immigrants, particularly a young woman named Kate Steinle in San Francisco, who was killed by a severely mentally ill immigrant under very strange circumstances that ultimately led to his acquittal. But Trump fixated on her and her tragic death, calling her beautiful Kate.
Well, let's take that, I guess, in reverse order. I mean, the Laken-Riley Act, which you pointed out, has now been signed into law, basically does two big things. The first is that it mandates the arrest, or was euphemistically referred to as detention, of non-citizens accused of crime. Unfortunately, it doesn't do anything to do violence to or penetrate sanctuary policies. So, I mean, you're talking about places that don't have those types of policies in effect, but it does lead to what will, I'm sure, be challenged in court as unlawful detentions. The second thing that it does is that it kind of empowers potentially a single state attorney general and a single federal judge to have veto power over positive exercises of discretion by the executive branch when it comes to providing kind of liminal status to immigrants. And some people refer to that as a sort of Governor Abbott provision of the law, which will unfortunately provide much more impetus for, again, these nativist attorneys general, state governors, and some of these reckless individual judges who have been trying to do these nationwide injunctions. Politically, it is a really big blinking red light at the retreat and even surrender that Democrats in Washington, D.C. are engaging in. And I think Republicans were even caught by surprise by how quickly Democrats kind of folded and caved in on this one. And I think, unfortunately, it's giving them renewed motivation for some of these bills that we're going to see in the next couple of weeks that will go even beyond the Laken-Riley Act. You're right to point out that like so many things involved in the kind of Trump MAGA movement, they demagogue and exploit tragedy. I mean, and really, it's despicable the way in which they do that. They take these tragedies and then use them as a means of scapegoating entire groups of people. And so it was named in response to that tragedy in Georgia. But you're also right to point out, and this is something I don't know, that I'm borderline obsessed with. People forget that Trump came down the escalator in June of 2015 and could have been kind of laughed off the stage. I mean, at the time he was a laughing stock. And people thought, wow, it's almost comical how racist he was. And, his campaign, like other Republicans, could have started and ended in a matter of weeks. But it was a couple of weeks after that, if you recall, Daniel, is when the Steinle tragedy occurred. And again, that's an extraordinarily complex story. I'm not even sure in the end that the immigrant who was very addled and, somehow found a lost gun from a law enforcement agent. I'm not even sure he was undocumented. He was actually brought back to San Francisco for a small marijuana charge. Again, sort of highlighting the risks involved in fusing local criminal law enforcement. But the more important point is this. People forget that the Steinle tragedy, the announcement of the Trump campaign, that all took place at around the same time of the historic week of progress, where Obamacare was defended, where the right to marriage was affirmed for the LGBTQ community, and where the Confederate flag came down, I think, in South Carolina. And instead of covering those events, and people were jubilant on MSNBC talking about how, Obama was going to be like, Reagan for the Democrats, and that there was this inexorable march toward progress. And while, so-called left was kind of popping champagne corks about their own success, Fox News had basically decided to ignore all of those stories and just go all in all the time on the Steinle story. And in so many ways, the Steinle story provided a kind of infusion of legitimacy, which buoyed the Trump campaign right from the beginning. And you're quite right to point out that this group called the Angel Moms, which itself is a subsidiary of the Tanton Eugenics Network, got introduced to Trump. And then he discovered the potency of highlighting crimes committed by immigrants as a means of demonizing the entire community. And in some sense, I guess in his mind, of proving that he was right on the escalator.
This is Sarah Jaffe, and you are listening to The Dig with Daniel Denvir, my favorite podcast for thoughtful discussions on the U.S. left and beyond, and you can support it on patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig, like every episode of The Dig, is produced in partnership with Jacobin Magazine. Jacobin is an incredible publication, and you've probably seen a lot of what they've published online. But they also have a really beautiful print magazine. It comes out quarterly and has well over 100 pages packed with illustrations, infographics, and some of the best graphic design in the country. Dig listeners can join 50,000 Jacobin subscribers developing socialist political thought and debate for just $15 a year. $15 gets you an entire year of Jacobin in print and access to the magazine's entire back catalog. If you've never subscribed to Jacobin before, you can access this deal by going to bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. That's bit.ly/digjacobin, bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. We've seen a lot of really fast-moving, intense geopolitical conflict around deportation, like immediately after Trump took office. And there's a lot to cover here, and we can't cover it all in a ton of detail, but there's the possible deal with El Salvador to make it a third country deportee hub. We've seen pushback in various forms on mass deportation from Brazil, Honduras, and most dramatically, Colombia. Then we have this, for now on pause, trade war with Canada and Mexico, ostensibly over both migration and fentanyl trafficking. Let's start by talking about the Latin American resistance to the extent that we've seen it. What do you make of the various cases we've seen and what they might portend about how this all plays out over the coming months and years? Gustavo Petro, who's in a tough place domestically in Colombia right now, the first left-wing president ever elected in the country, he dramatically stood up against the U.S. deporting migrants in this really humiliating fashion, shackled on military planes, which prompted Trump to impose or threaten to impose massive tariffs for Petro to counter with his own. But then they came to some sort of agreement that was described as Petro capitulating. But I mean, he wasn't saying he wasn't going to accept deportation flights. He said that he wasn't going to accept them, his co-nationals being deported in such a humiliating fashion. And the result of the agreement was Colombian military planes bringing deportees back. And then there's Mexico, where AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, he'd seemed to sort of do what he could to keep Trump off his back, which led to a lot of problematic assistance to the U.S. cracking down on migrants. And I mean, out of sympathy for Mexico, I understand they are in a tough position, as that apocryphal quote attributed to Porfirio Diaz has always put it, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. I mean, any sort of left government project in Mexico is in a tough bind. But that said, a lot of AMLO's immigration assistance to the U.S., enforcement assistance to the U.S. was not good. Now we have Sheinbaum, and I think it's an interesting question as to to what degree we've seen a shift there. What do you make about how these geopolitics have played out in terms of not El Salvador, which I want to get to in a minute, or the Latin American countries run by the right, but in terms of these conflicts with left-led Latin American countries, namely Colombia and Mexico, but also Brazil and Honduras to various degrees?
I think it's a big question, and I think it's going to be crucial to the story that unfolds in the next 4 years, which is to say how neighboring countries react to the Trump project. And I think the jury is still out. But I mean, clearly, if we understand the moral panic around migration as, exercise of a flailing empire to kind of reassert its legitimacy and dominance by, for example, even though it's undermining it by raising the idea that refugees are somehow a threat to the most powerful nation on earth. If that's the case, I do think some of the reaction is going to have to come from the global South and I think it's going to depend a little bit on how far the Trump administration pushes things. Another common misconception, obviously, a big misconception about immigration enforcement, has having to do with the wall, which we've already discussed, is somehow the idea that, a tall, thin wall will, solve these geopolitical problems. But in fact, the Department of Homeland Security, since its inception after 9/11, has been pursuing a policy of enforcement externalization that does not see the border wall as a kind of physical entity, between San Diego and Tijuana, but as something that extends into the United States. The border wall is being defended in sheriff offices in Kansas and out of the United States. And so it's no accident, I think, that ICE has a presence in I want to say over 50 countries, might even be more than that. And, Europeans for a long time have understood this notion of border enforcement externalization. I think this is a new concept for people in this country, I think, to kind of wrap their heads around. There's no doubt in my mind that the single most important political actor in responding to Trump is going to be the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, for a variety of reasons, some of which you've already pointed out. For, the project to succeed, Mexico has to cooperate. And there are many even Supreme Court cases from Trump 1.0, which the entire holdings of the case are contingent in some ways on Mexican cooperation or acquiescence with the border enforcement policy, which of course itself, again, is riddled with contradiction and irony when you're talking about a reaction to U.S. sovereignty. But I think what happens with the Mexican president in particular, I think is very important for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is because, what is commonly referred to as, I think it's wrongly referred to as right populism. The fever of that has not yet broken out in Mexico. And I think on the one hand, I think, the president has to be very attuned to domestic politics. On the other hand, like her predecessor, AMLO, I think she realizes that the Mexican role in all of this gives a good amount of leverage, which can be, I think, exercised bidirectionally. And up until now, it appears that President Sheinbaum has been much more shrewd in how she has been standing up to the Trump administration. And I think that that's going to be very important as some of these policies are either implemented or knocked down. Other countries as well will play a role. I think all of us were excited at first to see the Colombian response. And, maybe there was a little bit of backsliding on that. But we're going to see, I think, a lot more of that. I mean, I remember a story where, when we were challenging Arizona's SB 1070 and Utah started to kind of dabble in, the idea that they were going to do a copycat bill. And I can't remember, but some constellation of Central American countries basically said, if you do this, we're going to deny visas to Mormon missionaries in our countries. And, magically the proposal disappeared. And so, will there be collective action? Will there be courageous leadership? We're going to see. But up until now, I think it's very important for people to follow along very carefully what Sheinbaum is doing in her mañaneras, because up until now, she has done the one thing which, again, and not to just continue to litigate my hostility toward the Democratic Party, but what has not happened in the United States, which is that, I don't know, we're 10 years into this whole Trump situation. And, and I ask friends and colleagues all the time, name a single household name, Mexican-American, who has punched back, even as Trump has been punching down. Almost everyone knows who Senator Marco Rubio is. Very few people know nationally, I think, who Senator Padilla is from California, or who Senator Menendez was from New Jersey. And so the idea that there is a person of prominence.
Senator Menendez is now known.
I guess, yeah, right. Yeah. He's okay. Fair enough.
For I think gold bars.
Yeah, gold bars and all kinds of mischief.
Egyptian deep
but
state.
But the idea that Sheinbaum is punching back is something that people have been waiting for a long time. And it wasn't AMLO's style to punch back. Now, again, how long will she punch back? Will she cross-leverage considerations from, migration for other goals? The jury is still out on that. But there's no question that AMLO studied the situation in Turkey, where Erdogan basically had this kind of, unholy alliance with Europe to basically do the dirty work of immigration, interdiction, and enforcement as both ascending.
In exchange for Europe not messing with.
Essentially, yes. Essentially, in his case. Now, Mexico might have other things that they cross-trade for, but they learned that there was leverage that was effectively utilized by Turkey. And people have worried about this so-called Turkification of Mexico, because it is both ascending and a receiving country, as you know. So you have, people coming up through Central and South America, and you also have Mexicans coming into the United States, and how they will kind of wield that, positioning is extremely important.
If it wasn't for AMLO's cooperation on the externalization of immigration enforcement under both Trump and Biden, we would have heard a lot more from both of those administrations about the so-called authoritarianism of AMLO's project in Mexico.
I think that's probably right. Although you still got that from, the kind of Atlantic Magazine, David Frum type.
Totally. But it wasn't really echoed in the halls of power in a really unusual way, given how this often plays out in Latin America.
Yeah, no, we this time around, people rightfully, noted that all of these like tech billionaires were sitting in front of cabinet officers at the inauguration. But like famously in 2017, there was some story about like the number of private jets that flew from Mexico City to Washington, D.C. to attend the Trump inauguration, to remind them of the interdependence of the two of the two countries. And again, I think it's going to play out in various ways, but I think it's, to the extent that people have not been paying attention to Mexican politics, now is a good time to start paying attention. And there are a number of things that I think Sheinbaum will be able to do if she retains the political will.
As I mentioned at the top of the last question, Trump is in talks with El Salvador's authoritarian Bitcoin enthusiast president Nayib Bukele over a deal that would send to El Salvador migrants from other countries, including by sending alleged Venezuelan gang members into El Salvador's brutally inhumane prison system. And then just yesterday, I think, Bukele tweeted an offer to take prisoners from the U.S. into that prison system, including U.S. citizens. And the tweet was accompanied by these disturbing photos of just people being rendered into human cattle in this system, and him just gloating over it, just absolutely repulsive. But what does this tell us about the way that externalization is working with reactionary leaders across the region who, in terms of how they're aligning their own domestic reactionary projects with the United States' domestic reactionary project, and the role that immigration plays in building that sort of regional reactionary alliance? As you mentioned, this is clearly a global phenomenon, this externalization of immigration enforcement and detention. The EU's deals with Turkey, or with brutal Libyan militias who run torture camps for African migrants, or Italy's deal with Albania, or the Australian detention centers that were on the island of Nauru. What should we make of this potential deal with El Salvador in particular?
Well, I mean, events have overtaken our preparation for this interview, because it wasn't just a tweet from Bukele. Secretary of State Rubio was in El Salvador and has issued his own press statements. And I don't have them in front of me, but talking about how the offer was an incredible act of friendship from El Salvador. And in fact, I think even Rubio went further to say that mass migration has become a global security threat. The idea that migration itself is a security threat, which is, new kind of iterated, versions of the same discourse we've been talking about. But no, you're right to point out. I mean, El Salvador.
Yeah, Rubio called Bukele's offer, quote, an act of extraordinary friendship.
And then there's the additional quotes about migration as a threat, to all. And El Salvador is it's the sort of Silicon Valley of fascist innovation right now in our hemisphere. It has been for a while a laboratory for fascist political consolidation of power. And it is worrisome, to say the least, this idea that you have a president in El Salvador basically offering to convert his country into a penal colony, after the United States has been involved in, instigating civil wars, in having exported organized crime. These gangs that get maligned in El Salvador were not creations of El Salvador; they're creations of Los Angeles and the United States. They're they're prisoners that are basically getting a university education in transnational crime while in custody in the United States, and are released back to destabilize El Salvador even further, which is what obviously precipitates people fleeing to come to this country in the first place. And now this. And it is extraordinarily, nerve-wracking. I went to, we have organizations that we work with in El Salvador, and last time I was there, I went to that famous place. I think they call it the Centro de Confinamiento de Terrorismo, which I think is, the Center for Terrorist Confinement, which has been scarcely written about in the United States press, but which is on track to be the largest prison possibly in the world, where they have been arresting people without due process. Among the things that are so scary about that place, it's right by the airport, and they've built this entire geographic, what they refer to as a triangle, and think of the construction of prisons as a means of economic development. And so this notion that this idea of housing inmates, whether they're Salvadoran nationals or others, as a sort of like a new evolution of this kind of privatization of incarceration, is extraordinarily scary.
Making money off of imprisoning migrants deported from the U.S. and potentially also through forcefully migrating incarcerated Americans to be imprisoned in El Salvador.
100%, and not just making money, but making political power and legitimacy, and performing the again false theater of security along the way, which has been so instrumental to Bukele's popularity, which is real, by the way. And the warrantless arrest of so many people has led to a kind of near-term sense of security. But of course, it's a very myopic move, which maybe is a Band-Aid, but doesn't address the underlying problems faced by the country.
A couple of months ago, we did a 3-part series on the history and present of Central America with Jorge Cuellar and Hillary Goodfriend that I highly recommend folks listen to if they want to understand where Bukele comes from.
Yeah, that was really fantastic. And again, you would require, I don't know, that was like 8 hours in total or something like that, but it requires a lot to understand. But again, it's one of those places where people really ought to pay attention to what's happening in El Salvador, whether it was their Bitcoin beach, which again portended this kind of like, crypto bro political, project. And now this notion that they're going to be willing recipients of the kind of export of for-profit prisons. It really has a lot to do with where we are, which, while we're on the topic, is also very related to the way in which Salvadorans are uniquely deprived of political equality in this country as well. There are not, until very recently, I think that there were no members of Congress of Salvadoran descent. You rarely, you hear quite a bit of talk about Salvadorans, in the context of, MS-13 crime, yeah, and the like. But, you rarely, certainly in politics or in the media, hear the voices of Salvadorans themselves. And hopefully that's something that's going to change in the next 4 years.
We should also note that Trump's declared that he's going to turn the U.S. military base that's illegally occupying Guantanamo Bay. And that should really be mentioned in every single mainstream media account of anything that happens in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. But he's turning that into a migrant detention center. Not the first time that's happened in U.S. history. But this time, there's something really unsettlingly poignant about just the way the war on terror from the get-go has been boomeranging, coming home to roost as the war on migrants.
Yeah, and he says that he's going to do that, but we have to avoid falling into the trap of kind of assuming that these declarations, whether it's about Guantanamo or what just happened yesterday in El Salvador, are going to happen as if by, fiat or ratification through Fox News. In other words, he can say that he's going to, do that, but there still remain, levers of power that can prevent him from doing it. And it's one of the things that, and again, it has to do, I think, with this trap that we all face in this, Trump situation, which is, and it reminds me of the way Karl Rove used to malign the left as a so-called reality-based community. It was something that happened after 9/11, where Karl Rove mocked the left as being stuck in the reality-based community. And I think, he said famously that, while the left is sort of using empiricism and trying to examine events, that they were busy constructing new events that would be examined tomorrow by the left through their empiricism. And then the most ominous part of that quote was, this is the new definition of empire, that somehow these new sort of, vectors of reality just get imposed on us. We have to kind of make sense of them and then figure out how to respond. But, it is crazy to think that we are going to somehow outsource, I think, which is one of the terms used either by Bukele or Rubio, the idea of, imprisoning people to places outside the United States, particularly as, we're having debates about birthright citizenship and other, notions of sovereignty that are being called into question. And I do think, a helpful kind of context in order to kind of make sense of all of this. There is a scholar at UCLA Law School, Tendai Achueme, who has written a really great law review article called Migration as Decolonization, examining the ways in which migration is destabilizing and causing mutations in the way that the global North thinks of its sovereignty. And I would encourage your readers to read that article and start to think a little bit more broadly about what's happening.
Trump has also ended temporary protected status, or TPS, for 300,000 Venezuelans. And that's just in the short term. There are, I think, 250,000 odd more who are likely going to lose it in the medium term. This right around when the administration secured Nicolas Maduro's apparent approval to accept deportation flights to Venezuela. There are also lots of other people from countries like Haiti who are covered by TPS and who will also, as far as I can tell, likely face termination of their legal status as well. What is TPS? What's the significance of this move, and what will the likely consequences be?
You're right. Just like during Trump 1.0, during the famous, shithole countries outburst where he tried to de-document people with temporary status, he has initially moved to try to terminate TPS status for Venezuelans in what I think is an unlawful exercise of his authority, and hopefully, like the litigation that we undertook to defend TPS during the first time, we'll be able to, put sand in the gears there. I do think it's important for your listeners to understand the significance of the temporary protected status sort of statute and population of people who received the liminal status. Congress passed a law basically providing the president with the discretion to provide liminal legal status at its discretion in certain cases where, it wouldn't be safe for people to return. And for a long time, that has been kind of public enemy number one as a kind of statutory legislative matter for the nativists. They are hell-bent on erasing that from the federal codes because they perceive it as a sort of ongoing way in which presidents can provide amnesty, even if it doesn't offer an immediate, direct path to naturalization. And, so I think that, we can expect that there will be more efforts to try to de-document people with TPS, many of whom have U.S. citizen members of their families, children who are U.S. citizens, in an effort to destabilize those families and to try to encourage them to leave. And I think ultimately we will see in Congress Republicans seek to repeal the TPS from the books, and that goes to another. Just like we had mentioned Laken Riley, which is like at one and the same time you have Trump trying to exert new executive authority, bullying co-equal branches of government, Congress and the judiciary. But at the other hand, Laken Riley basically allows anyone from Texas or Kansas to have a veto authority over that executive discretion. Similarly, this is kind of weird that in some ways, by demonizing immigrants, the Trump administration is sort of in league with those that are trying to emasculate executive authority to do the right thing. And what is so incredibly angering about this is that while Republicans have been demonizing and going after TPS and TPS holders for a long time, Democrats scarcely knew that this existed. And you could imagine a kind of alternate sort of fork in the road of the multiverse where, President Biden on his first day in office used the TPS statute to amnesty all the essential workers during COVID. And he could have done it. And actually it was litigation proof. It was something that he could have done and chose not to do. And at least then there would have been a temporary benefit that could then, it's harder to kind of claw back benefits, as the Trump administration learned the first time around. There were three big arguments that we brought in the Ramos litigation against the efforts to de-document TPS holders the first time around. The first was that they just sort of violated procedures that are required for exercises of discretion. The second, and perhaps more importantly this time around, was that the decisions violated the 14th Amendment because they were just overtly racist. And I think if and when, for example, the Trump administration tries to terminate TPS for Haitians, it's relatively clear that that will be a 14th Amendment violation based on what they have said during the campaign. And then the third question relates to a violation of liberty interests for the U.S. citizen children who then, if their parents are dedocumented, have to choose between their country of citizenship and their parents, which is a violation of fundamental liberties, which I think was one of those more difficult or far-reaching arguments that we made, but maybe might be more important this time around.
One thing that's interesting here is that if you look at the history of U.S. immigration policy, Cuba, Vietnam, more recently Ukraine, the U.S. government often uses immigration policy, particularly asylum policy, to make it easier for people to come to the U.S. when doing so suits U.S. foreign policy interests. And in the past, the U.S. welcoming people fleeing an enemy of the U.S., like Maduro's Venezuela, that would have made a lot of sense from the perspective of U.S. imperial power. But as we've also seen with Trump moving to shut down, Trump/Musk moving to shut down USAID, it's long been clear, really, that Trump wants to do U.S. imperialism through hard power alone, without the soft power that's always been so important for the consolidation of post-World War II American hegemony. What do you make of immigration sort of being taken out of the imperial toolkit in this manner?
Yeah, it's hard to wrap one's mind around it. I mean, people, when they think about asylum, think in commonly will even say political asylum, because, the notion of asylum laws and norms were very much developed hand in hand as instruments of foreign policy following the Second World War. And, there are people that have warned for a long time that the asylum system was being overburdened by application beyond the scope of kind of foreign policy goals. And so, and that the idea that somehow there would be a backlash against asylum, I think is something that people have warned of. And again, it's a whole other podcast, but the Biden administration more or less put the death in long established norms of asylum by its retreat during its administration. What comes next? I'm not sure, but it also comes at a time in which, you're quite right to kind of point out that, that there has been also a kind of a collapse of distinction, if you will, between asylum seekers and those who are commonly referred to as, economic refugees or non-asylum seeking migrants who come in irregular forms. And one of the real dangers with the way in which the Democrats have kind of totally botched immigration over the last 25 years is this idea of lending credence to the idea that a path to citizenship was like a form of asylum, that everything was essentially like a gift bestowed on, the poor, scared, other coming here. And so there's, an overlay between the protections that, the country has kind of consolidated support around, for example, for dreamers who came here through, quote unquote, no fault of their own, and those that have TPS. But now there's even more categories of people who have this kind of liminal temporary status. And I do think going forward, it's going to be incumbent upon us to unite the interests of the TPS holders who might get dedocumented if Trump has his way, the dreamers who might get dedocumented. We haven't talked about the doleros, but the workers who came forward and got status, and those who received some temporary protections under parole as well. I think it's going to be really important that we do that, even at one and the same time, as we don't fall into this trap, which we often do, which is, and I think the left is guilty of this too, of kind of somehow importing in this assumption that all migrants are coming from, quote unquote, shithole countries.
Trump also shut down CBP-1. It was an app created by the Biden administration that allowed asylum seekers at the southern border to book an appointment to make their case. This is something that Biden paired with a draconian ban on seeking asylum for those who cross the border without authorization. But now we have, thanks to Biden, that form of asylum all but dead. And thanks to Trump, there's no app. Why did asylum become such a major avenue for migrants irregularly crossing the southern border? And what is asylum's status as we speak?
Well, I mean, like I said, I think if the Trump administration has its way, there will be no more asylum status. And, you say the Biden administration allowed asylum seekers to use the CB1 app. I mean, the other way to look at it is that they were forced to use it.
Right.
And that was part of, is it a Democratic or, was there bipartisan support? But it was part of this notion of doing, the safe third country, in-country processing. So the idea that no longer should you be allowed to arrive at the United States and then avail yourself of due process and having your claim adjudicated, whether it was a risk to your life to go back. The idea was that there would be processing in the countries where people come from or in countries along the way, and the app sort of was meant in service of that kind of change in the regime. What happens now, I think, is anyone's guess, and we're only 2 weeks into this, but there's no question that they want to, seal the border wholesale, full stop.
The move to end birthright citizenship, Trump's simple declaration that the plain language of the 14th Amendment doesn't say what it clearly says. I mean, people are saying it's unlikely to survive legal challenge, though I don't find any far-right program to be implausible anymore. But people say it's unlikely to survive legal challenge. But one thing we were discussing the other day is you saying one thing we don't hear much of is Democrats defending birthright citizenship on principle, just these formal arguments about constitutional law. What's going on here, and could this still end up being a major political win for the far right, even if they do fail in court?
I think that they very much anticipated the fragility of their legal position, but didn't care because they know that they're going to, I think, distort, their chances of prevailing along the way. And so, I think that this is among the most, it's hard to kind of create like a kind of like comparative misery index where you say which is the worst outrage. But this is among the most scary, I think, because it changes the basis for the foundation of equal rights under the law that are shared by all in this country. And it redefines the kind of we the people in a way that is far more reaching than just whether and how someone came on a visa or not. And I think it's troubling in part because I think, there is a sense that somehow this is the most vulnerable of the executive orders to federal litigation. And I hope that those legal scholars are right. But it is ironic that now, people ostensibly on the left who are challenging the birthright, the anti-birthright citizenship order on, so-called textualist grounds that the order violates the plain meaning of the 14th Amendment, which is very clear. But even as we're doing that and making, I think, what will be ultimately successful arguments in federal court, and even I think the Roberts Court will, perceive this hopefully as having gone too far. Even as we're doing that, the Trump administration and their surrogates are advancing normative arguments that are already having an impact in terms of distorting the terms of debate. And in anticipation of this question, I even pulled up, hopefully I can find it. Honestly, I was in, and I don't know if this is like a taboo to talk bad about fellow podcasters, but I was listening to Ezra Klein's podcast recently in which, they were casually referencing this attack, on birthright citizenship. First, Ezra Klein sort of expressed his own discomfort with what he referred to as birthright tourism, which I don't even know if that's a real thing outside of Breitbart.com. But then Matt Yglesias said, and I'm quoting, clearly this is a quote, "If the president of the United States really wants to shine a spotlight on birth tourism and say that we need a bipartisan legislative solution to create some kind of denaturalization process for egregious abuses, I think that's tough for swing state Democrats or anyone to say, no, birth tourism is amazing." So you can already see an erosion. And by the way, preceding all this, I think Klein says that he's like the most pro-immigrant podcaster in America. I'm honestly not exaggerating. I think he might have said that. And here you have Matt Yglesias just casually fucking around and talking about how there should be a conversation about denaturalization. And, I don't know if he's among your listeners, but I would hope if he was that he would immediately clarify that this country should not have conversations about denaturalization, because to do so, again, brings you down a slippery slope that no one can see the end toward. I mean, your listeners might know, and sorry to get so animated about this, but this is so foundational to so much. The idea, countries obviously are, as Benedict Anderson said, famously imagined communities, they're social constructs. We decide the kind of who are the we along the way. There are two basic ways in which countries assert, citizenship and membership. And it's, jus sanguinis and jus soli, from the blood and from the land. And the best argument for birthright citizenship, which again has a long history that precedes even the 14th Amendment, of struggle among African Americans who were not enslaved to have their own rights and membership in the U.S. as citizens. But the biggest argument in the end in favor of birthright citizenship normatively is that it is just simply not of the blood. Because the minute you start to enter into the questions of whose blood is what, history is replete with examples of how dangerous that is. And unfortunately, people like Ezra Klein just provided evidence of that, because then next thing you know it, you're talking about, things that don't exist like birth tourism. And, you're starting to apply bloodline tests to a country that, foundationally was a country of, settler colonialists. And so it is imperative that we fight back really hard on this in the courts and in the courts of public opinion. And I will just end on the one positive note, which is, my own partner would be denaturalized if this executive order were to go into effect, because even if it was to apply prospectively, the next step would obviously to apply it retroactively. Look at what they've done in the Dominican Republic with, Dominicans of Haitian descent. And by the test that they've imposed, again, by fiat, and as a way of kind of transmuting political and legal discussions, there's no telling where it's going to end. And this is something that is not to be messed with, whether in courts or in the courts of public opinion on podcasts like this. But the optimistic point, which I was going to end at, is that so many people get put in harm's way by this, that I think it allows the immigrant rights community to kind of come up with a new, moral normative foundation for sort of who the we are, and how do we think about how the they become we and the like. And I think we'll be able to do that in a way that is much more widely encompassing, not just of undocumented immigrants, but of everyone in this country.
Yeah, this is a really core issue that Democrats, by and large, there are of course exceptions, but by and large, the leadership, the establishment, they are not making a substantive case for immigration at all, let alone for immigrant rights. These are people operating from this Clintonian triangulation playbook, but it's just capitulation on the far right's core issue. There's no plausible alternative being offered. And there's no plausible alternative being offered, not just on immigration, but for the MAGA vision for America across the board. And the risks here are enormous. We've already seen those risks become a reality because Trump is now back in the White House. If you do not contest the fundamental premise of your opponent, if you cede that, you are ceding everything, and they've ceded it all.
And I mean, it's worse than that, and we can talk at length about, and you do in your book, about how that came to be with the kind of series of losing double or nothing bets on a comprehensive immigration reform project. But it's actually even so much worse than that, because the other thing that, I've heard on this podcast and others have said. But part of what Trump does in demonizing immigrants and scapegoating them and, accusing them of all things is they're able to distract from their own failure to govern by shifting the lens to immigrants. And so to the extent that Democrats now in the short term think that it's somehow like tactically advantageous for them to, capitulate to Trump, it will just simply actually help Trump, undermine any other, projects that they have to defend core functions of the government. And so, the Democrats are falling into a real trap, first through their triangulation, now through their, wholesale capitulation. And hopefully that will change. And hopefully Democrats, and by the way, again, speaking reflectively, immigrant rights proponents like myself, I think we do have to provide a more ample framework for people to situate their opposition to Trumpism, because it might not be 2017, but there is a reflexive, I think, opposition to Trump's brutality and just how grotesque his treatment of immigrants is, and I think it's going to be very important for us to find on-ramps for people to support a competing vision. And up until now, Democrats have not provided that at all.
This, though, is a change from 2017, 2018, really through 2020. I thought, and this is an erroneous prediction that I make at the end of my otherwise perfect book, I thought that Trump's extremism had undermined the bipartisan basis for the war on immigrants that had created Trump in the first place, because that's what I was seeing at the time. We saw very mainstream Democrats, not just progressives or the left, falling over themselves to loudly declare that they supported migrant rights, decrying Trump's abuses. That changed so fast over the Biden administration, which, the 2020 primary had almost everyone running for the Democratic president declaring that they would support decriminalizing unlawful entry, a misdemeanor. And, we are now sitting in the wake of that election, an election that Biden and then Harris ran as a tough on the border, tough on so-called illegal immigration campaign. We're sitting in the wake of that with them blaming the left, the so-called groups, for forcing the Democratic Party so far to the left that they became vulnerable to Trump's attacks. How did we have this 4-year interlude where Democrats were good and didn't suck on immigration, and why did they snap back so quickly?
Honestly, it's hard to say, and I think it's something that I'm very worried about, because I think we need to have new words to describe the way in which Democrats are surrendering so quickly and turning, on themselves as well as some, I guess, some kind of effort to achieve a kind of political, life raft. I mean, you mentioned, we talked about Laken Riley, Senator Ruben Gallego from Arizona, who himself occupies that seat because of years of struggle against Arpaio, years of struggle against SB 1070, years of political education and organizing that tempered at least Arizona, the Arizonification of the country. The idea that someone like that would volunteer to put his name as a co-sponsor of that legislation.
He'd been a member of the Progressive Caucus in the House, and he was, this is the product of not only all the struggle you mentioned, but just the partisan outrage from ordinary Democrats over Kyrsten Sinema's behavior. He took her seat.
No, I mean, who, by the way, did, for all of her, faults as a senator, who did, herself join and struggle and march, actually, physically, against SB 1070. No, what Ruben Gallego has done is so myopic and so short-sighted and so, frankly, just stupid. But it's also a betrayal. And, someone told me that the reason why he's doing this is because he's got his finger in the political wind, and someone has told him that, particularly with the softening of support for, Democrats among Latino men, that he might be an ideal vice president in 2028. And maybe that's what's motivating him. I can't look into his soul, but it's emblematic of, this kind of betrayal of those that have defended, shared values, and even in Ruben's case, put him in a position where he is. And now I don't know what to make of this, Daniel. I mean, I don't know if I could reverse and start asking you questions, but this antipathy toward the immigrant rights groups. I mean, you have, on the one hand, you have, Republicans, scapegoating immigrants for all things. And now the Democratic Party seems to be consolidating around this scapegoating of immigrant rights advocates, as if somehow, they were listening to us and not actually refusing to listen to us, as they actually, did over all these years. It's very bizarre. And honestly, the thing that I keep coming back to is an argument that I think I first heard on this podcast, offered by Femi Taiwo, about elite capture, where, Taiwo talks about how certain, struggles for social justice get co-opted and hijacked and then transmuted by elites who then have a kind of differing interest, their own interests get separated from the people that they're representing. In some ways, the interesting irony of this attack on the so-called groups by the Democrats is that the groups that led to this, problem in a way were the elites who kind of had co-opted immigrant rights as an issue in the first place. And so, there are two authors of a recent Atlantic magazine post, Frank Sherry and Cecilia Munoz, who blame groups like Endelon, like mine, for, again, I guess, ostensibly pushing Democrats too far to the left on immigration. But these two people, Sherry and Munoz, were precisely the two people that Democrats have listened to the most for the last 20 years. Munoz was on the transition team, and Frank Sherry worked quite literally in Wilmington, Delaware for the Biden campaign. So it's almost like this projection where they're trying to avoid responsibility by blaming others, but it's very insidious because there has been incredible hostility to immigrant rights groups, as if somehow we are to blame for the Democratic Party's, mess and illegibility on where they stand on this issue.
I want to get into the Sherry and Munoz piece in the Atlantic in a second, but first, just to talk about what accounts for the shift. I mean, I think it's just Democrats' regression to their mean politics on immigration. Trump was so polarizing, and he polarized so much around his anti-immigrant extremism that the resistance energy from liberals and the left that greeted his first term, that was something that they briefly rode that pro-immigrant energy. But the second under Biden that they felt any sort of public opinion shifting against them, they returned to form by triangulating and entailing the Republicans. So that's part of it. And then there's the way that, because the groups discourse, blaming the groups for Harris's loss, it's not just about immigration. It's blaming the left for Harris's loss, even though she ran one of the most revoltingly right-wing Democratic presidential campaigns I've ever even heard of, literally campaigning with Liz Cheney. And what's that about? Well, that's about the fact that the American left, really well beyond its real power and capacities, put forward in 2016 and 2020 in the Bernie campaigns a meaningful, popular, substantive alternative to MAGA America, precisely what no other current in the Democratic Party can provide, and without which Trumpism can never be defeated. And the Democratic establishment, the same Democratic establishment complaining about the groups now, are precisely the same people who prioritized defeating the left that had the energy, the optimism, and the alternative to take on Trumpism. They made that, in not defeating Trump, their top priority. And they succeeded. They crushed Bernie twice. And that's what the groups discourse is all about. It's about obscuring that plain as day actual history of what the fuck has happened over the past decade.
Oh, 100%. And in the immigrant rights context, I mean, just look no further than, there were, I taught a class at UCLA, there were probably less than 100 people who were most responsible for winning DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is the biggest step forward for undocumented immigrants since 1986. And the Obama administration has done worse than gaslight them in terms of depriving them of what should be understood as, their historical achievement, a young group of non-citizen civil rights leaders forcing a president to do something that, by the way, ultimately benefited him in 2012. But that gets rewritten in history as if somehow, Obama bestowed a gift on dreamers, which of course is much worse because he was saying on the one, it's like, the good news is, I'm not going to deport anyone but criminals. The bad news is everyone's a criminal except for, the dreamers. And yeah, you're right. There is a reverting to the mean in a way that at this time, I think it is far more dangerous. And you can see it by the way Democrats are responding to the doublespeak about, prioritization of criminals by the Trump administration. So on the one hand, again, you have Trump saying, I'm going to prioritize criminals for removal. On the other hand, you have, his press secretary saying all undocumented immigrants are criminals. But then you have Democrats rushing to say, oh yeah, we want to deport criminals too. And they don't realize they're lending credence to a much bigger effort to criminalize millions of people. And they're not getting any benefit in return from this capitulation. And I think that that's something that people are going to have to play, to watch, a close eye on. And we've mentioned multiple times triangulation. I do think it's worth unpacking for those who haven't read your book, who aren't familiar with the famous strategy of Clinton in the 90s, to understand what they were doing. But what they were trying to do during the Obama years in particular was to play all sides on immigration, essentially to say, we are both for mass deportation, as again, Obama deported more people than any president in history, but we're also for legalizing the dreamers. And if we can continue to blame the Republicans, for blocking progress, we take that issue away from them because we're for smart deportations and the like. And we're seeing the total bankruptcy of that approach now. And now it's like Democrats have nowhere to go. And so I think it's a very alarming thing that you see so many Democrats rushing to basically be like, oh yeah, we're in favor of, deporting criminals, even as literally millions of people are being criminalized in the process.
I want to get into that Atlantic essay a little more by Frank Sherry and Cecilia Munoz. Sherry is the former head of America's Voice, which was the sort of major mainstream immigration reform group. And he was recently, as I think you mentioned, advising Harris's presidential campaign on immigration. So funny that he blames the groups for pushing Harris to the left because he was the one advising Harris to be tough on immigration. Anyhow, Munoz was a top leader of the mainstream Latino civil rights group formerly known as La Raza, now Unidos, and served as the head of domestic policy for Obama while he was deporter-in-chief. Awkward. Anyhow, the two of them wrote this essay arguing that Democrats need to return to advocating for what was called comprehensive immigration reform. They needed to do this to win on immigration. And this was the policy that they were the chief architects and leaders of for so many years. And what CIR, Comprehensive Immigration Reform, what that was this legislative effort throughout the aughts through 2013. Is that right? The last attempt? Through 2013 to tie into one big package a pathway to citizenship with more enforcement and border militarization, plus guest worker programs to make business happy. These were the three prongs of CIR. And they wrote, quote, how did Democrats fall so far and so quickly on immigration? It's easy to blame Trump and the lure of his xenophobic rhetoric. But we believe that immigration has become a losing issue for Democrats over the past decade because elected leaders have followed progressive advocates to the left beyond the political space available to them. Voters, feeling unheard and frustrated, may have squirmed at Trump's racism and radicalism, but they also saw him as someone who took the problem seriously and was trying to address it. There are so many things wrong with this extremely self-serving essay, and I want to point out a really basic thing that's wrong with it. As my book examines, and as I've discussed with you countless times, it was in fact the comprehensive immigration reform status quo that led to Trump being elected. That was the dominant politics within the Democratic Party with the rise of the Tea Party far right and then Trump. And they're very misleading on this, I think, for a good reason, leaving the implication that the country elected Trump in 2016 because the Democratic Party had moved left on immigration. The Democratic Party had not moved left on immigration. Sherry and Munoz are blaming the groups because they can't accept their own role in building a democratic immigration politics that moved immigration politics, moved the center of it so far to the right that Trumpism was what anti-immigrant conservatism looked like in this country. And they also don't have any account of why comprehensive immigration reform always failed to become law. And it always failed to become law because the Republican nativist right, throughout this whole process, when they were offering this support, supposedly reasonable package that would bring peace to immigration politics and be a winning issue for Democrats, their politics of nativist appeasement only radicalized the Republican right again and again and again throughout the whole period. They did not have a politics that contested the basic premise of the nativist right, that premise being that immigration is a problem that needs to be solved. They have no historical account of how immigration gets made into an issue, let alone a crisis in the first place, which is in fact the first question that needs to be answered in the fundamental fight that needs to be had.
Oh boy. I mean, so much to say about this. And, I don't want to get myself in trouble or any more trouble than they've already put us in with that terrible op-ed, which I don't know how many people have read it, but unfortunately it is scaring Democratic political elites and foundations away from giving money to organizations that this country is going to rely on in the next four years. You're right to point out that Sherry and Munoz were essentially the two leading generals for the last 25 years in this campaign for comprehensive immigration reform legislation, which again, in a weird kind of permutation of elite capture, they, kind of conflated this triangulating abomination of legislation, which, never passed and actually made things worse, with somehow the entirety of the immigrant rights movement. And ironically, part of what they did in marshaling, tens, even hundreds of millions of dollars behind this losing legislative campaign and losing political project was they basically vacuumed up the collective power of local organizations that were doing immigrant rights and basically put all eggs in the basket of potentially, this legislative and political project. And I say legislative and political project because it's not even clear at this point whether or not, maybe people upstream of them even wanted to succeed. For a long time, I think people could make sense of the CIR campaign as a kind of potential win-win for Democrats, where they would either get, the policy victory if they somehow converted this legislation into law, or they would get good politics by, again, triangulating and blaming Republicans for being racist, anti-Latino, and the like. And it's now clear that they obviously didn't get the policy, and the politics have now flipped the other way.
And yet that's exactly what they tried to do again. And I don't want to take us too far down this rabbit hole, but with that stupid immigration enforcement bill that they dared Republicans to vote against, thinking that it would be some miraculously brilliant 12th dimensional chess to call their bluff.
No, that's right.
Idiots.
No, I mean, and they were elated when Trump became the nominee in 2016, because in some ways that was the culmination of the project that tried to caricature Republicans as anti-immigrant and anti-Latino, which we can bracket and talk about how itself, that it, might have been, a racist or certainly racializing conflation of Latino and immigrant identity by Democrats. The thing that I find most sort of hilarious, though, which I was going to say, I don't know either of them well. Clearly, they know that they are implicated in some way in this destruction of the terms of the entire debate and even American democracy. Honestly, the way in which immigration is being used as a cudgel to tear down key pillars of democracy. They know that they've been quoted, in major news outlets for the last 25 years. And I think that this essay, I assume, was an effort on their part to exculpate themselves from their own role. I mean, it would have been nice if they had done a kind of careful searching reflection of what, went wrong. You could definitely say, for example, if CIR had passed in 2007 or 2013, that we might have avoided this whole Trump situation. And you can also say that all major legislation only, at the time it's being considered has a 5% chance of succeeding, and then we take it for granted. And you can say that they might have pursued all this with good intentions, but the reality is that the double or nothing bet on CIR has failed, and the consequences now are extreme. And to me, the thing that I found so hilarious about that essay was that these are the two literal putative self-appointed leaders of what they think of as a movement, even though it wasn't a movement, it denuded movement, and it was just a legislative or political campaign. But it's so lazy. I mean, that's like the thing. I mean, it doesn't actually serve as this kind of like historical exoneration. This might be the last time anyone listens to them. Maybe that's good that this is the last time anyone listens to them. But it actually serves as a capstone to just how shabby and lazy they are. And as you point out, and it's like, I don't have it in front of me, but like they keep referring to it as like the issue. Oh, the issue is bad. To hell with the issue. I mean, people, it itself is sort of like dehumanizing, but it shows, and again, it's this weird permutation of elite capture where they no longer even thought about the material consequences in essence of what they were doing. They're now more concerned about, the legislative prospects for the Democrats. And I can just say, I mean, it's a pile on, but like what's so absurd about this, particularly coming from those two, is, before Frank was the head of the America's Voice, which I think, again, self-appointed by foundations as the communications voice of, 12 million people or more. I don't know who appointed them or whatever. He was the head of the National Immigration Forum. And the National Immigration Forum was responsible for the 86 amnesty, which, people forget. It came, the good news is you got an amnesty for, 3.5 plus million undocumented immigrants. The bad news is forever more immigrant work was criminalized. That was the trade-off. That was the version of the deal. And they knew, and Frank knew full well, that amnesty legislation, mass amnesty legislation, has to come from the right. And it has to be a sweetener to a bill that comes from the right. And so for many years preceding the 2013 effort, they had run what was essentially a right-left campaign. And they knew that the window of opportunity for a comprehensive reform came under Bush 1 or Bush 2, because, he was trying to, redefine politics. But it was also them that then in the failure of the 2007 bill, maybe the best chance that CIR ever had of passing and the time where it should have passed, it was them who then mortgaged the entire immigration issue to Democrats who, as we've discussed multiple times before, really don't give a shit about, the impact. They care more about the issue. And, see, for example, Ruben Gallego, who when asked about legislation, didn't know the details of the policy, but clearly had some understanding of what he was doing politically. So for these guys to now go back and blame groups for their own failures is really something.
In 2000, the American labor movement made this gigantic shift, supporting the legalization of undocumented immigrants, which it had not supported in the past. It was this huge shift to push forward the cause of building a united labor movement that organized workers regardless of legal status. Where do things sit with labor right now? I was very disturbed to see recent comments from Teamsters President Sean O'Brien saying, quote, "I think the biggest problem is people are trying to protect illegal aliens that come here and commit crimes, and that's unacceptable." And, quote, "Social issues are well and good, but protecting illegal immigrants that come into our country to commit crimes and steal jobs, that's a tough pill to swallow." And he said those things on his podcast to Josh Hawley. Fortunately, I think it's fair to say most of the labor movement is not where Sean O'Brien is. But what do you make of O'Brien's comments and where the labor movement is in general right now?
There's lots to say about this. For a long time, there has been a disconnect between progressive leaders of unions from the AFL and from Change to Win unions, or those that left in 2006, and their own members. What O'Brien has done in some ways is to say the quiet part out loud, which is that there is an extraordinary strain of nativism and xenophobia in the labor movement in this country. And that has been a taboo topic for far too long, and one that I hope that you'll explore on this podcast going forward, because it is, again, he's putting voice to things that we've seen from others, and it is a reversion back to the kind of, Fortress USA, conflating Made in America and Union Made type of nationalism from the 90s, and it's really troublesome. And it's really troublesome at a time when the labor movement, despite whatever the headlines of the day of recent activism, is in real in real trouble. And from O'Brien, it is an astonishing lack of solidarity with his own members. I don't know how many have TPS, who Trump is trying to criminalize and de-document, but hopefully he'll stand with them if and when the time comes, even if he's going to demonize others. But this is, I think, maybe an opportunity in the collapse of the comprehensive reform campaign, which put all the eggs in the basket of a so-called path to citizenship. It might be a time for organized labor to find different forms of solidarity with workers of all persuasions, across borders and across circumstances, because that has been lacking. You pointed out in 2000, or I don't know, it was 1999 going to 2000, it was, militant labor activism from, in particular, hotel workers led by Marilena Durazo, and who's now a state senator in California, and the janitors, which forced the AFL to change its position on amnesty. 2 years later, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision in the case of Hoffman Plastics versus NLRB, reversed all of the preceding decisions in a case that basically, Hoffman Plastics was a case that said that undocumented workers didn't have the same remedies under the National Labor Relations Act as work-authorized immigrants or U.S. citizens. And that's because labor law and immigration law in this country have been in conflict since 1986, since that amnesty. A byproduct of the idea that all employers are now deputized to verify immigration status, even though that's never enforced against employers, but is enforced against employees, is that it literally puts inexorably in opposition the goals of labor enforcement and immigration enforcement. And of course, labor enforcement is complaint-driven. We require collective bargaining. We require people to step forward and assert their rights. But since 2002, there has been, a widening social distance between immigrants and labor remedies. And hopefully the AFL and others, organized labor, will align themselves with bottom-up efforts of solidarity and unity that we're seeing all across the country, and not capitulate to these top-down kind of forms of division. And again, O'Brien should be ashamed of himself, and people who are Teamsters should call and demand better from the president speaking in their name. But I do think it's very, very important that we find a way to enlist those in the labor movement with a new effort. And again, you can't blame labor, for example, for recoiling at the capitulation on guest workers in 2006 as a price for the so-called path to citizenship, because again, a byproduct of this campaign for 25 years, led again first by Republicans, then by Democrats, was precisely to pit undocumented immigrants' interests against everybody else's. So another way of thinking about these deals on CIR is that it's like, if you want legalization or membership into the empire for undocumented people here, well, the price is that you're going to have to screw over the people that might come tomorrow. Or, this idea of creating a class whose interests are in opposition to one another. And maybe the fact that we're no longer under the thumb of that project or the sole unifying agenda for immigrant rights will allow for more natural forms of solidarity from unions, because we're going to need it. There's no question. And we do have a real problem.
One thing that's been interesting about the Trump administration, and also just really entertaining, has been that rift that opened up on the MAGA right between racist nationalist populists like Bannon and Laura Loomer on the one hand, and tech billionaire reactionaries like Musk and Ramaswamy on the other hand, over H-1B guest worker visas, which big tech companies use all the time, and white nationalist racist populists don't like because they don't want non-white people coming to the country no matter what. What do you make of that contradiction, and how might it or related contradictions play out in the coming months and years?
The thing about it is that I think the purveyors of this kind of anti-immigrant fascist project are very comfortable with the hypocrisy. So they're comfortable with, Trump hiring undocumented workers and also, pledging to deport them. And so as a kind of political project, they in fact utilize those contradictions to their advantage to kind of assert that, membership in, whatever Mar-a-Lago conception of U.S. citizenship, white nationalist ideal of citizenship, comes with the benefit of being able to be hypocritical on this issue, that you can kind of do both, hire and rely on undocumented work and also dehumanize and criminalize it. Where the rubber meets the road does seem to happen at the level of Bannon and Musk with respect to these H-1 visas. And I think it's going to be an interesting thing to see if we can find wedges within MAGA that begin to peel back, some support for the anti-immigrant agenda of the MAGA administration without kind of ratifying some of their racist and xenophobic tendencies. And I think if you're scoring it at home, it seems like at the moment Musk is winning. But again, I would caution people because again, they like to flaunt the hypocrisy as a means of kind of cosplaying the power and the power to be hypocritical and not consistent that comes along with being a U.S. citizen, oligarch, wannabe, or whatever. And that is something that I think we're going to have to contend with. But the flip side of this, as you know from having done guest lectures in my class, is that there are contradictions on the other side as well that I think we do need to reckon with. And so, for example, if being a progressive in 2025 means one's commitment to the expansion of the New Deal and the welfare state, or if Bernie, for example, is the avatar of progressivism, well, how do you both defend universal health care, expansion of the welfare state, the project of the New Deal, while also, and I'll just speak casually, leaning toward open borders? There does need to be a sort of finite sort of for redistribution and the like. And I think one of the deficiencies of the Bernie-led movement has been to contend with some of these contradictions that exist within the left. And I hope that we elevate them and have good discussions about how to get out from underneath them. But, and again, not to keep citing your own podcast on your own podcast, but, I remember listening to Ruthie Wilson Gilmore speaking with you, talking about the need for any social justice movement at this point in 2025 to think beyond the parameters of nationalism. And I think, a challenge is going to be for us to work at the community level, again, fighting the top-down division with bottom-up unity against all these projects, while also creating something that's translocal and transnational in scope that kind of gets out of this kind of nationalist trap that even the left is in, whether it's the AFL or Bernie Sanders himself.
At the end of the day, we know that crackdowns on undocumented immigrants terrorize undocumented immigrants, that they reinforce undocumented immigrants' subordinated status within society and the labor market. But what we've never seen is really any sort of policy that would actually remove undocumented immigrants in large numbers from the formal labor market. And it seems pretty straightforwardly that's because it would be bad for capitalists. And capitalists have a lot of political power, including over the presidency, very, very much including the Trump presidency. And so we don't hear Trump loudly calling for a crackdown on employers who hire undocumented immigrants. And that's interesting, because this is maybe how you could, I'm not trying to give advice to nativist reactionaries out there, hypothetically how you could really drive undocumented people out of formal workplaces and maybe out of the country. But ever since Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, or IRCA, it seems pretty clear that there's no political will, no matter how much anti-immigrant venom these people spew, no political will to force employers to fire and not hire undocumented workers. IRCA had these employer sanctions provisions, as you mentioned, but they never really had teeth. And so with Trump, it's been interesting. During his 2016 presidential campaign, he supported requiring all employers to check immigration status through a system called E-Verify, but he never really ran on it. That was not a central message for Trump. And then by 2019, he was telling Fox News that it would be a, quote, tough thing for industries like agriculture. Quote, so in a certain way, I speak against myself, but you also have to have a world of some practicality. Is it fair to say that while big business obviously does not, in a total kind of like marionette fashion, like move every gesture of right-wing politics, but that it does kind of set a perimeter around where it can go on immigration?
To be determined, obviously, like so many things. I mean, it used to be that these kind of technological employer sanctions enforcement regimes were seen as a bargaining chip for legalization, and they seem to have fallen by the wayside. But that goes to show, again, how unserious the idea of doing, employer-side enforcement always was, going back to 1986, when, again, I point out, immigrant work was criminalized, and I'm not saying anyone should be criminalized, but certainly the employers of immigrants were not criminalized or enforced against. But again, there was this notion that somehow if you could cut access to jobs, that you would, turn off the so-called magnet for, migration into the United States. Where does that go? I don't know. I mean, I will point out again that, and not to place blame elsewhere, but I mean, it has been the failure of unions to organize low-wage immigrant workers since 1986 at scale that led to the emergence of worker centers like the network that I work at and other immigrant worker centers, which have responded to gaps in the labor movement, and hopefully there will be some new forms of worker-led organizing, even as we see maybe that this is like a pain point that's too hard for any of Trump's oligarchical supporters to accept in the form of employer-based immigration enforcement. I mean, the tricky thing is that this is a really, and maybe something that you could explore down the line. It's tricky because, in the immigrant rights advocacy community, there is an aversion to reduce the worth of immigrants to the value of their labor and to think of them merely as workers performing economic functions. And I think that that's a well-intended aversion. On the other hand, there is power in labor, and there's power in worker identity, and I would say even untapped power among immigrants in this country to, achieve, economic pain, which might change the terms of the debate. I think we're going to have to navigate those boundaries at a time when again, there is this rampant, dehumanization of immigrants in general and devaluing of immigrant work. And by the way, no more crystallized than during the COVID-19 pandemic, where, people were banging pots and pans to, applaud so-called essential workers who didn't afford the luxury of being able to, isolate and work by Zoom. And, they were getting, applause on social media, but also being permitted to basically work to their death so that others could live. And I mean, definitely here at Endelon, we've always been very hostile to arguments about if you take away immigrants and the fruit will rot on the trees. That's the one that, by the way, you could probably Google it. I bet you Frank Sherry and Cecilia Munoz have said those exact words multiple times over the last 20 years. And I don't think we want to rest on those types of dehumanizing arguments that elevate the well-being of fruit over workers. But also, I think we have to be careful about how not to essentialize it. And also, as you point out, making real pain on these people that are on the receiving end of the highest amount of income and inequality in American history.
Well, these are very different ways of making worker identity central to immigrant rights. One is a socialist or social democratic way, and the other is a liberal way. The liberal way of, if we don't have undocumented immigrants, the fruit is going to rot on the tree. That is framing undocumented immigrants as workers from the consumer perspective. The left alternative to that is weaving immigrant worker identity into a larger tapestry of working class identity, because this is something that Frank Sherry and Cecilia Munoz can't understand due to being liberals. Standalone advocacy for immigrant rights, as important as, doing that is, it's not going to ultimately fix the problem. Immigrant rights needs to be woven into a broader politics that builds a multiracial working class constituency and movement around a multiracial working class politics. You can't just address immigrant rights without addressing the real problems that the scapegoating of immigrants mystifies.
100%. And this is why, again, this elusive path to citizenship was so, it had people marching in the wrong direction, as if somehow the path to citizenship was the end of the road and not political and economic equality that, I guess was implicit in the promise of it. And of course, the path to citizenship has been elusive, and the political and economic inequality is widened. And I think these things, they interrelate. And so you now have, for example, Trump trying to redefine U.S. citizenship with his project to denaturalize children of immigrants. And he's trying to reconceptualize citizenship as this somehow like this gift that is bestowed on the consumers, or, another way to think about it is, he has this notion of citizenship that he's proffering against, across all these different nodes that we've talked about, that envisions U.S. citizenship as if it's somehow like membership, not just in the empire, but membership in a country club, and, like Mar-a-Lago-based citizenship. And I think that the pursuit of that as an end, as opposed to as a means to an end, has been one of the things that, again, has bedeviled the immigrant rights community. And I think you're quite right. And again, if there's hope for optimism, it is that there will be, I think, new, by necessity, forms of bottom-up organizing that will percolate upward, even as we see, the top-down efforts to divide by the Republicans and this wholesale surrender by the Democrats.
Well, Chris Newman, thanks very much.
Oh, it was my absolute privilege. I really, really appreciate it, Daniel. Thank you for the time, and thank you for your work.
Chris Newman is legal director at the National Day Laborer Organizing Network, Endelon, and faculty in the UCLA Labor Studies Department. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, After noting that, the ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organization. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theorio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram at thedigradio. And please find us wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it is on iTunes or Spotify or wherever, also leave us a nice review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is you telling other people to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com to make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.